The New Yorker has a somewhat infamous policy of using dots in the place of hyphens in certain compound words, like re-election and coordinate, but this is an affectation exclusive to them. Frankly, the most common use of the dots in English culture is just to make made-up names look more European, like the American ice cream brand Häagen-Dazs, whose name doesn't actually mean anything in any language. Because German and Scandinavian rock bands were once considered really tough and hardcore, there was this whole tradition of British and American bands putting pointless dots over the letters in their names in order to make them look cooler. This is the so-called metal umlauts phenomenon. I believe that déjà vu is the only English phrase that uses acute marks that slant both right and left. Piñata and jalapeno are probably the only words commonly used in English that feature a little wavy line known as a tilde over one of the letters. Facade is likewise probably the only common English word to have the little curly tail thing on the C, which is called a sedella. And chateau is the only word to have a little triangle hat known as a circumflex. And again, you can see that this is always being done in the context of loan words that are being directly lifted from other languages. Overall, the use of accent marks in English words is generally considered a very formal or even slightly pretentious thing. And in most cases, no one will think you've done anything wrong if you write a word like cafe without the accent. The only exception would be for a very small handful of words that need an accent in order for that word to be distinguished from another word that is otherwise spelled the exact same way, like expose versus expose. So as we all know, there are 26 letters in the English alphabet, and these are all that you need to know in order to read 99.99% of all English words. There do exist, however, a couple of other very obscure letters that you only see used once in a very great while, usually just to spell relatively archaic formal words that originated from Latin. This thing, for example, is known as an ash, and it is pronounced E. It is considered mostly redundant these days because it provides no real functional difference from just writing an E or an AE. But that said, into the early 20th century, it remained relatively common for some writers in England and America to use the ash when writing certain words with a strong and obvious Latin influence. Words like archaeologist or aesthetic. But even this relatively limited use has now been mostly phased out, and today you will only ever see the ash used to give a little bit of visual flair to something, like the Encyclopedia Britannica logo or the movie Aeon Flux. The ethel, which is also just pronounced E, is even more obscure and served a similar function in English up until the early 20th century. It was sometimes used to write Latin-influenced words like esophagus or fetus. But unless you plan on reading any Victorian-era medical journals anytime soon, it is probably not that relevant to know. English has evolved a great deal over the centuries, with the earliest forms of English basically incoherent to English speakers today. People like to make videos and things speculating about just how far back in time you could travel in ancient England and still understand what is being said, with the general consensus being that you probably couldn't go back any further than the end of the 15th century, which was the start of the so-called early modern English period. Now, most English speakers today have a sort of vague familiarity with early modern English, thanks chiefly to the continued popularity of the plays of Shakespeare, who died in 1616, and the King James translation of the Bible, which came out in 1611. And the ongoing cultural influence of these two bodies of work has left a lot of people with certain stereotypes and cliches of how Old English was written and spoken in what the TV tropes people refer to as ye old butchered English. Thine formula is simple. Addest thou eth and est to random verbs, scatterest thou silent e's like the leaves of autumn, bandiest about the words thee, thou, thine, doth, hast, and forsooth, reversest upon every other occasion thine noun-verb order, and streweth thou dost be the next Billy Shakespeare. Knowing some of these cliches can be useful for understanding works of British or American pop culture, where this self-consciously archaic style of writing and speaking is often used to give a sense of timeless grandness to a narrator or character. God, for instance, is often made to speak this way.
Thou hast forsaken my church.
And of course, using vague approximations of old-fashioned English spellings and phrasings on signs and labels and things is often done to give commercial products a quaint and charming historic vibe, even though the nostalgia factor is entirely contrived. A fun bit of English trivia I've always liked is the fact that the Quakers were infamous for continuing to speak in old-timey English well into the 20th century, as we can see depicted in this scene from Oliver Stone's movie about Richard Nixon, who was raised in a strict Quaker family in the 1920s.
Because Harold has thy father's will is no reason to admire him. Let Harold's worldliness be a warning to thee, not an example.
Yes, Mother.
Thy father will have to know of thy lying.
No, please don't.
Richard, I expected more from thee.
Please, Mama. I shall never let thee down again.
Talking that way in modern times obviously comes off as a little pretentious now, but the Quakers were actually trying to come off as humble and modest, using Old English pronouns and forms of address like thee and thou and thy was supposed to make their interactions with other people seem less personal and individualistic, and thereby more in tune with our universal status as children of God, or something. Anyway, talking of pretentious, let us now discuss. So the Quakers' protestations notwithstanding, modern English is pretty egalitarian. Unlike a lot of other languages, English speakers do not use different pronouns and verbs when speaking to a social superior, and there exists no formal grammar that you're supposed to switch to in formal situations. I was watching a really good video recently about the most taboo words in Japanese, and it was striking how many of them just related to using informal forms of address when speaking to other people.
This word is sometimes okay to use with very close male friends, but I typically avoid it even around my closest male Japanese friends. And you should never, ever use it with strangers.
But that said, there was a time when English was more class conscious, and some small artifacts of this history still survive today, mostly in the context of British royalty. The word sire is one. This is a super formal version of sir that was once used as a way to address nobility. Today, however, even the King of England himself is of the opinion that the normal version of sir is just fine, and sire is now pretty much exclusively used in the context of pop culture characters interacting with fantasy monarchs.
What would you suggest we do, sire?
Hire smaller musicians?
Humor. Very good, sire.
The so-called royal we is another artifact of a more socially stratified time. In ancient English, high-status people used collective pronouns like us and we and our to refer to themselves, while only lower-class people would say things like me and my and I. British kings and queens continue to use the royal we to this day, but now only when communicating to the public in official government documents. For example, when King Charles officially declared the start of the recent British election, he phrased it this way in the British Gazette. Whereas we have thought it fit, by and with the advice of our Privy Council, to dissolve this present Parliament, and we, being desirous and resolved as soon as may be to meet our people and to have their advice in Parliament, do hereby make known to all our loving subjects our royal will and pleasure to call a new Parliament. In the King's social media posts, by contrast, he just says I and my. Same within any public speeches he gives, even the really formal ones.
I look forward to welcoming His Excellency the President by my beloved mother, the late Queen.
In fact, based on the primary sources I looked at, for the last 400 years or so, British kings and queens have always addressed the public using I and my. Even Queen Elizabeth I used I and my in her famous 1588 speech to the troops at Tilbury. There is a popular stereotype that the notoriously uptight Queen Victoria used the royal we in casual conversation, but I couldn't find any evidence of this. Even the famous anecdote about her saying, "We are not amused," seems to be a mischaracterization of a time that she was actually speaking on behalf of a